Well, this evening's video blog from the Senior Common Room of the University of Bath is on the 16th of March 2009. And I'm going to focus on the politics of educational knowledge because of my experience that quite a number of people who would like to put forward their embodied knowledge in their narratives into a university for accredited programs have, over the years, found certain pressures, which I link to the politics of educational knowledge, not to do this kind of research. One of my earliest experiences of this was when I was acting as a consultant at Kingston University in the UK in 1991. And the money was being paid to the University of Bath for me to support the development of action research in the Department of Education. And a head teacher put forward a research proposal, which, being action research, was a self-study. It had I in the title, and it was about improving her own practice. So the question was of the kind, how do I improve what I'm doing? And what staggered me was the response of the research committee, who wrote back asking that the personal pronoun should be removed from the title. Now, I met this requirement with this kind of mixture of hilarity and rage. The hilarity was from the thought, well, how could people who had any comprehension whatsoever of educational research, and in particular action research, ask for the I to be removed from the inquiry when this was a particular requirement of the action research? The rage was linked to that in terms of the politics of educational knowledge. And it was concerned with a group of people who appeared to be, if you like, so arrogant that they felt that they could ask for the requirement of the removal of the I from a very form of research that required it. Now, the politics of this process are such that it didn't take too long before that decision was actually reversed and the person was allowed to conduct that kind of inquiry. But quite a bit of pressure had to be put forward on that particular research committee to get that decision reversed. Now, the politics of educational knowledge have been with me for years, and I first encountered them when I was studying educational theory at the Institute of Education at London University. And the view of educational theory that was put forward, largely by the professors there, and two in particular called Richard Peters and Paul Hurst, was that educational theory was constituted by the philosophy, psychology, sociology, and history of education. Now, when I started studying this form of educational theory in 1968, I definitely went along with it, and I got my academic diploma in philosophy and psychology, believing in that view of educational theory. But I was also teaching full-time in the East End of London. And after I'd registered for my master's in the psychology of education at the Institute, I began to question that view of educational theory. Because I felt, after 4 years teaching, that I was beginning to be competent in my classroom practice and to know something of my educational influence with my students. And in fact, I could build what I considered to be valid explanations of my influence, both in my own learning and the learning of my students. And these explanations were based on the practical principles that I used to give meaning and purpose to my life. But at the time, the philosophers of education said that these practical principles of mine, which I used to make sense of the world and my life, were at best, and I quote, they were at best pragmatic maxims that had a first crude and superficial justification in practice, that in any rationally developed theory would be replaced by principles with more theoretical justification. Now, what continues to outrage me is that sense of replace, that the philosophers believed, and they brought me to a belief initially, that my practical principles that I used and I gave meaning and purpose to my life in education would be replaced by the principles of the philosophy, psychology, sociology, and history of education. And in fact, that's what moved me to the University of Bath in 1973, to try to actually see if I could reconstitute or contribute to the reconstruction of educational theory in a way that related directly to the practical principles that educators use to make sense of their lives with their students. Now, that is an illustration for me of the politics of educational knowledge, not so much in a philosophical mistake that is made in thinking, but in the power relations that actually influence the lives of individual teachers and their continuing professional development programs, which are structured with that view of educational theory. I hope I'm making that distinction clear, because we all make mistakes. The issue is living with the consequences of our mistakes, and also at times apologising for those where we've imposed our ideas and they've actually damaged people. So the politics of educational knowledge seem to me to be vitally important. On my website, actionresearch.net, if you go into the Master Educators programs, you'll see a dissertation there by Jeff Suderman Gladwell, who was studying at Brock University. Again, he was studying use the process of action research. And the ethics committee of the university said that he couldn't actually conduct the research because of the ethical principles involved in research with children, even though Jeff Suderman Gladwell was studying his own practice. What Jeff did was to actually study the ethics of the ethics committee. And his dissertation, I do think, is a superb example of how, with a passion for academic freedom, you can actually put forward your accounts in a way that actually shows some of the politics of educational knowledge in action. Now, recently, I was, again, deeply offended when a student's work in relation to a master's dissertation that he put forward was actually failed by someone who was clearly not an exponent of a living educational theory approach to educational research. And by a living educational theory, I'm meaning the explanations that practitioners produce to explain their educational influences in their own learning, in the learning of others, and in the learning of the socio-cultural formations in which we live and work. Now, this particular person wrote in his criticisms that he could not understand why an educator needed to bring his embodied knowledge into the academy for accreditation. Now, that one statement demonstrates to me an ignorance of a field of inquiry of living educational theory, which itself has actually shown that it has got an international influence in the world. Individual practitioners have now got a history over the last certainly 13 years through 26 doctoral theses in our university library justifying why practitioners should be bringing their embodied knowledge into the academy for accreditation. And in recent papers in Research Intelligence of the newsletter of the British Education Research Association, the case is being made that these practitioner researcher accounts are constituting an epistemological transformation in educational knowledge. So I think, unfortunately, the politics of educational research and educational knowledge are very much alive within the university context in accrediting particular kinds of knowledge. And in this, I would say that there is still a paradigm war going on, which I would not wish to participate in, and yet which I cannot avoid. Okay, thank you. Good night.